Some things start with whispers. At first, they hover near your ears, just a vague feeling. Then, that feeling seeps under your skin, turning into a glance, a touch, a moment, and eventually you reach a point where you can't pretend it isn't there anymore. Those moments, they were what scared me the most. I'm Elisa, 48 years old. My whole life I tried to do the right thing. I thought my second marriage would bring me peace, but Leonard, he didn't give me peace, he gave me loneliness. His absence had been a part of my life for so long that I stopped feeling it, at least until I started losing myself in someone else's gaze. Jake, Leonard's son from his first marriage, 28 years old, strong, mature, the kind of man you notice. When I first met him, he was distant, but over time, the space between us shrank. Now he was too close, too warm, and we both knew it, but we acted like we didn't that night when the power went out. I was home alone. I went to the kitchen to find a candle, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling inside me. I called Leonard. "What do you want me to do?" "Elisa, I'm out of town." His voice was laced with impatience, his usual indifference. "I'm alone," I said. There was a pause, just for a second. Then his response came. "I'll send Jake over." I didn't say anything, but something inside me trembled. Half an hour later, Jake was at the door, a flashlight in his hand, that familiar look on his face, the one that always said too much without actually saying anything. "Your dad said you were freaking out," he said, his voice calm, but laced with something else, something playful. I just don't like being alone," I replied. I realized then that my fingers were gripping the edge of the door frame a little too tightly. Jake stepped inside. It had been raining a little. His leather jacket was damp, his broad shoulders gleaming under the dim light from outside. I shut the door. "The power's still out," I muttered. Jake's eyes locked onto mine. "Is that a bad thing?" Something inside me snapped, and I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. Jake tilted his head slightly, still standing at the door. Then he lifted the flashlight, shining it directly at my face. I squinted as my eyes adjusted, but I could feel his gaze traveling downward. I was in my usual home clothes, a thin nightgown that barely reached my knees. I wasn't wearing anything underneath. I had been about to go to bed when the power cut out. I had thrown on a light cardigan over my shoulders, but I hadn't bothered to tie it. My feet were bare. Jake's eyes lingered at my ankles for a moment, then slowly trailed upward. "Anyway," he said, his voice coming out low, "go sit on the couch. I'll check the fuse box." There was a strange unease in me. I was tense, but I didn't know why Jake lived alone just 15 minutes away by car. His own place, his own routine, his own life. But right now, he was here in this house with me. I silently made my way to the couch in the living room while Jake walked toward the fuse box, flashlight in hand. I took a deep breath, clasping my hands together in my lap. That's when I realized my whole body was tense. He flipped the switch. Click. For a brief second, the lights flickered, but then everything went dark again. Jake let out a sigh, probably too much load on one of the circuits. He muttered. Then he turned his flashlight toward the kitchen. "Let me check what's causing it," he said, stepping inside. I hadn't noticed that he went. Into the kitchen, I assumed he had gone down to the basement, since the fuse box was right next to the basement door. Then something fell. A loud metallic clang echoed through the dark. I jumped. "Jake." I stood up quickly, walking toward the pitch-black kitchen. "Jake." No answer. I took another step forward. The moonlight filtering through the kitchen window cast faint shadows, but everything was still hidden in darkness. I couldn't see him, but I felt something, a movement. Just as I was about to turn, my chest collided with something solid, a body. Jake, the flashlight had slipped from his hand, its beam now cast off to the side. His warm, firm body was pressed against mine, and for a brief moment, a shockwave ran through me. Instinctively, I tried to step back, but Jake was standing right in front of me. "You came into the kitchen too?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I didn't know where you were, I said, my breath coming out unsteady. Jake's hand barely brushed my waist, maybe just for balance, but my body registered it as something much more. If this is your first time hearing confessions like this, and you want to support us, join my channel and turn on notifications before we continue. Trust me, you won't want the story to end. In the darkness, we couldn't see each other. We could only feel. And in that moment, I realized that the pull we had been pretending didn't exist had grown too strong. To ignore our breathing was the only sound in the heavy silence. Jake's breath was too close, and there was nothing stopping us from locking eyes. Except we couldn't, because everything around us was pitch black. I placed my hand on his chest, trying to step back slightly, but he didn't move, and neither did I. "Aliza?" he whispered. Just hearing my name in his voice sent a shiver through me. I needed to snap out of it. I shook my head slightly, took in an unsteady breath, and forced my voice to sound normal. "What's the problem?" I asked Jake. Slowly pulled his hand away from my waist, but he was still close. The flashlight had already fallen, and the kitchen was nearly swallowed in darkness. Only a faint sliver of moonlight trickled through the window, casting soft shadows over everything. "I think it's the washing machine," he murmured. "It must have been running when the power went out." Is trying to start back up," I swallowed hard. "So we need to unplug it, right?" Jake nodded but hesitated. There was a tension in the air, something unseen but completely felt. Finally, I saw the outline of his body shift as he moved toward the washing machine, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Then a loud clang echoed through the room. I flinched. "What was that?" I whispered. Jake had crouched down, but he lifted his head slightly. His lips curving into a small smile. "Think I knocked something over," he said. His voice was calm, too calm. Then he reached for the plug, pulling it out. I exhaled deeply, pressing my back against the counter, trying to steady myself. My heartbeat was still racing. I told myself to calm down, but how was I supposed to, even in the darkness? Nothing had changed because feelings, they didn't need light to be felt. Jake straightened up again, and I felt his eyes on me. "Why do you seem so tense?" he asked, his tone slightly teasing, but underneath it something else. "I'm not tense," I shot back immediately, but Jake didn't look convinced. I heard his footsteps in the dark. One step, then another. "I know," he said slowly. "I'm tense too." Something tightened inside me. I didn't know what to do. Should I step back? Should I look somewhere else in the room? But I didn't do any of those things because Jake was right in front of me, and I had let him get this close for a moment. I had no idea what was going to happen next. Jake was still standing there, his voice still low, and our bodies were almost touching at that moment. I realized that turning the power back on had become just an excuse. We didn't need excuses to stretch out this moment. But then suddenly Jake pulled back. "Let me take care of the fuse first," he said, his voice still rough around the edges. I just nodded. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Jake walked out of the kitchen toward the fuse box, even as I listened to his footsteps fade. The weight pressing down on me hadn't lifted. Then click. A moment of silence, and then a sudden flash of light filled the kitchen and the rest of the house as my eyes adjusted. I realized something. I felt exposed. The darkness had been a shield wrapping around me, but now everything was out in the open. Jake turned back around. The dim glow highlighted his face, and his leather jacket, still damp from the rain, looked even darker under the light. "All right," he said with a slight smile. "Problem solved, then." He tilted his head slightly, studying me, his brows raising just a little. "But you still look tense." I swallowed. "I just got startled, that's all." Jake let out a small chuckle, but his eyes never lost their focus. "Or," he said, stepping further into the kitchen, "is there another reason?" That feeling inside me stirred again, that uncomfortable but intoxicating feeling. "I don't know," I admitted. "Was that my voice shaking?" Jake took another step. Now he was standing right in front of me. "Elisa?" "You've changed lately," he said. His voice quieter now, but focused. My breathing picked up. "What do you mean?" Jake didn't look away. "Used to be calmer, stronger, but now you feel lost, don't you?" Something in me clenched. "Jake, but I couldn't finish my sentence because he was right. Leonard had left me alone for years, even when he was there. It was like he wasn't. At first, I waited, then I gave up. Then I realized I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I had become weak, lost, invisible. And Jake saw it. He placed his hand on the table, close, but not too close. He wasn't trapping me, but if I moved just a little, I could touch him. "I care about you," he said, his voice soft but steady. Something inside me shivered. "You pretend like you don't feel anything," he continued, "but you do, don't you, Leonard? Left you alone. He said he loved you, but he never showed it. And you got used to that. But, Elisa," he reached up, fingers brushing lightly past my hair. "I see you, just like that." Everything I had been holding in got caught in my throat. My eyes burned, but I refused to look at him. But I couldn't help it, because there was something in his eyes too. Loneliness, understanding, and something else. I took a deep breath and pulled back slightly, but Jake didn't move. I wasn't always like this," I whispered, "but now I don't even know who I am anymore." Jake shook his head. "You're still the same, you just need to remember." And then, just like that, the tears spilled down my cheeks. I instinctively reached up to wipe them, but Jake just tilted his head and watched me. "How long have you felt this way?" he asked. It was too hard to answer, so I just whispered, "A long time." Jake didn't look away. "Me too." And that was what broke the last of my resistance. Because this moment, it wasn't just about me. He was alone too. He wanted to be seen to matter. The silence in the kitchen grew heavier as my tears kept falling. Jake didn't judge me, he just understood. I had been alone for so long that this warmth, this moment wrapping around me, felt completely foreign, but it also felt terrifyingly right. Jake let out a slow breath, lifting his hand from the table and leaning back slightly. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the living room. "You look exhausted." "No way. We celebrating?" "Me fixing the fuse?" "Like this." I forced a small smile, but something inside me was still trembling. We walked into the living room together. Jake sat at one end of the couch, and I settled beside him. He had taken off his leather jacket. His t-shirt clung to his body, still slightly damp. He ran his fingers through his hair. He looked exhausted. I was exhausted too, but not just tonight, for years. Lost in the emptiness I had been drowning in for so long, I didn't even realize when I let my head rest against Jake's shoulder. His body was warm, solid, and for the first time in my life, I felt like someone was actually holding me. His breathing slowed, so did mine, and before I knew it, my eyes drifted shut. When I woke up, the room was dimly lit for a moment. I didn't know where I was. Then I felt it. My head was still resting on Jake's shoulder, and more importantly, his head was leaning slightly against mine too. My breath caught. Jake stirred slowly, his eyes opened. He lifted his head just a little, just enough for our eyes to meet. For a second, we just looked at each other, but that look, there was so much in that look. A warmth spread through me, my heartbeat kicked up. Jake's gaze dropped my lips. And then he leaned in, my breath hitched. He kissed me. At first slow, hesitant, but then everything we had been holding back crashed into that moment. My hands moved on their own, sliding over his shoulders. Jake's hand found my waist, pulling me closer. This was it. Something long buried, something forgotten, rising from the ashes, and this time I wanted it. I kissed him back fully, deliberately, and I knew nothing would ever be the same. When Jake finally pulled away, we were both breathless. We looked at each other. His eyes were still exploring me, still wanting me. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to run from it. Jake didn't look away. Instead, he whispered, his voice deep and slow, "I've liked you for a long time." My breath was unsteady, but his words unlocked something inside me. something that had been shut away for years. I swallowed, letting go of the turmoil inside me, and took a step toward him. I didn't break eye contact. I let everything I had been suppressing pour out. I've never felt anything this right before. Jake didn't hesitate, not for a second. He just watched me, and then we both moved at the same time, slow at first, then faster. Our lips crashed together again. This time there was no hesitation, no restraint, no denial. My hands slid up to his shoulders. His hands found my waist, pulling me in closer. My heart was pounding as we kissed. My fingers trailed down his arms, and then my hand reached for my straps. My breath caught as my fingers hooked around them, and slowly I slid them down. Jake froze as he watched me, but his eyes, they never left mine. He was seeing me, he was loving me, and that's why. Without a second thought, I let myself sink down onto the couch. Jake inhaled sharply, and in that moment, I knew there was no turning back for him either. Jake placed his knee on the couch, turning his face toward me as I lay back. I could see him freeing himself from his clothes, and it affected me more than I could put into words. He understood me. He cared about me. He was young and unbelievably handsome. For the first time, I didn't feel alone just then. I noticed the slow movement of his hand, and I loved it. I felt something bigger than anything I had ever known before this time. I didn't want to surrender to excitement. I wanted to surrender to emotion. I wasn't alone. I could feel that in every inch of my body. I opened my eyes, letting my hands slide down from Jake's shoulders. I wrapped my arms tightly around my own legs. Jake, breathless and flushed, looked irresistible, and in that exact moment my body tensed. My nails felt like they were almost piercing into my thighs. My legs locked completely, and with a loud cry, I surrendered myself. I was instinctively begging Jake to do the same. It didn't take long. He listened. I felt a deep warmth inside me, and afterward I whispered a soft thank you when he lay down beside me. He was completely out of breath. We didn't say a single word. I just listened to his heartbeat, waiting for his breathing to steady. And before I knew it, I had fallen asleep right there. I knew Leonard wasn't coming home, and in that moment, nothing else mattered, nothing but this sense of relief, this peace, as I slipped into sleep. When I woke up that morning, I had no idea Jake had a surprise waiting for me. I had never woken up this happy before, never felt so in love that I wanted to throw myself into a man's arms the second I opened my eyes. But this time everything was going to go even further. Stay tuned, because this story isn't over if you've made it this far. I know this story has pulled you in deep. There's so much more to share, and you don't want to miss a thing. So hit that follow button, turn on notifications,